All right, welcome to the show. We're here with Casey Jackson, Director of Institute for Individual and Organizational Change, and also Erik Wolfrum. Casey, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's
We're
good to
making
see you,
it
Casey.
Good to see Erik.
through our technological challenges here to make it work. But Casey, tell us about the organization and primarily what your focus at the organization is.
So I was on faculty for 16 years at WSU with the Washington Institute for Mental Health Research and Training, and doing a lot of work with the state mental health division, doing training and technical assistance, specifically in mental health and addiction areas. And I just became obsessed with this one particular method of communication that was an evidence-based practice, motivational interviewing, and it took off. And I could have kind of continued that under my role at WSU, but just knew that I could deliver more service to more people if I was doing it full time. So I just stepped off and started my own company, and had quite a few government contracts and started training on this. For me, with my background in social work and addiction, it was the first method that I ran across that was so consistent with really complex situations. So I've worked in prison systems, I've worked in child welfare, I've done work with education, and worked with drug treatment with adolescents. And at that point in my career, 15, 20 years into my career, I'd never ran across a model that was so consistently effective to actually change outcomes. You can go through training, you can, kind of look through the folder again after a training, but it never had, for me at least, it didn't have much staying power. And once I started training this to other professionals, it was a complete game changer. It started changing cultures of systems that I was working with. People were kind of getting a little burned out, were reinvested by the end of the training. I was excited when they were saying, I can't wait to get to work on Monday. I've got, 10 different clients or students that I'm thinking of, and I just can't wait to talk differently and see how this can work. And people honestly were coming back from training like day 2, day 3 and just saying, you know what, I'm talking to my family differently. I tried this with my kids. I tried this with my spouse. And I can't believe that it actually works. Like, it's not counseling. It's just communicating different. So all of those things.
One of the phrases I've heard you mention before is to be effective, that the goal is to get into the other individual's reality. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think you can look through any angle. I think as a professional, I think as a parent, in our culture, we just tend to be pretty self-centered, in not a negative way. We just tend to be thinking from our worldview first. And in this method of communication, because it's specifically about trying to affect behavior change, that's why it's not for all conversations, it's not for all interventions. If you're trying to affect behavior change, the traditional model we were raised in is a medical model, which means I'm the expert. I know the situation. I've got a lot of information. I've got a lot of data. I've got a lot of experience. And if you would just listen to me and do it this way, then life would be great. What the data shows is those methods of communication do not set up sustained behavior change. So when you're asking that question, Ryan, what this method is, if you're trying to affect behavior change, you step inside that person's reality. You have to leave your reality behind, which is difficult for most of us. But when you start to look through the lens of another person, you start to assess what are their values and look at the discrepancy between what they say their values are and their current behavior. What we tend to want to do is point that out. But if we point it out, it generates kind of a resistance or a discord between the two people. But if you can stay inside their reality, look at what their values are, and look at, like, trying to orchestrate or evoke from them, like, what might you do differently if your behavior lined up with the integrity or the respect or the trust that you say you operate by? How might you have dealt with this situation differently? And so you're trying to step inside their reality first, and then trying to evoke or elicit from them, you know, ways that they can move more in a direction that lines their behavior up with their values and their goals.
So, in terms of the transition from working for the university and then starting your own business, what do you feel like some of those challenges were? It sounded like you had some government contracts already in place, so you probably jumped off from there. But what were
Yeah.
some of the challenges to starting your own business?
Well, I'm not a business person. That's the biggest challenge. I'm a bleeding heart social worker. So
So, challenge number
coming
one.
up, challenge number one, and I didn't. I just don't feel like I was born to manage people. I like to be part of a team. So to have a company, to have a corporation, and have such a flat structure, I think was discombobulating for a lot of people. It's discombobulating for me, but it's just those were some of the challenges of, you know, when we grow up, if I could do it my way, which you both have been in positions of, um,
Mm-hmm.
does it work? The difference between theory and reality. And then within, just like with policies and, you know, all the things you have to do within a business structure, is it possible to do that? And the biggest challenge for me was just running a business, honestly. You put me in front of a group of people, letting me talk about what I love to talk about and watching their mindset shift. I can do that all day long, every day. But the business side of it was just, it's never been my happy place. But I've been around for, you know, 9 years now, going on our 10th year. So still been able to make it work.
Focusing on your passion. And I'd imagine, Erik, in the education world, I'd imagine a lot of Casey's organizational models or structures of communication is something you probably see with the larger organizations you work with, Erik.
Absolutely. You know, especially when Casey talks about that whole idea of change and how to communicate with one another. And I think that's a big piece. You know, Casey, one of the things that I've always wanted to ask and kind of talk about is you talk about this method of motivational interviewing. And I just think that's it's an interesting term. Where did that come from? Because when I think of that, just flat that interview piece, right? It's like, oh, we're interviewing, but really not what this is about. And so
Not at all.
I'm curious about that.
So the developer, the one whose kind of brainchild this was Dr. William Miller. And he's a research psychologist. He's a addiction specialist, brilliant, compassionate man. And he was on sabbatical. I can never remember, one of the Scandinavian countries, doing addiction education for grad students. And they were expected in the 80s. That's when I was raised in the addiction field, was in the late 80s. They were expecting to teach what I was raised in, which is really aggressive, abusive treatment of people with addiction to break their defense mechanisms. So they were expecting to come over and teach that. And he wasn't. And so he said these grad students were just relentless, like, you know, why are you doing it this way? Why are you doing it this way? And he said, so I just started writing down some thoughts. And he said, what I realized is whenever you confront anyone, they get defensive, whether or not they have an addiction issue. But we would stigmatize people with addiction issues and saying, well, they're just defensive because they're addicts. And he's like, that's just mathematically, that's, you confront anybody, they get defensive. He said, if you interview someone, just like Barbara Walters or Diane Sawyer, if you sit down and interview someone without judgment, people will talk. And he said they will disclose all sorts of things if you're listening and not judging them. And he said, so instead of trying to do therapy or counsel them necessarily, I just thought, I'm going to interview them, and do it from a place of genuine curiosity. And he said, when I would listen to people talk about their addiction issues, I really could start to see discrepancy between who they see themselves as and what their current behaviors are. And so I would just point out those discrepancies with no judgment again. And I noticed that people have a massive amount of ambivalence inside of themselves. And so he said, what I would do then is just listen past that and find out, well, once I understood their situations or dilemma from an addiction perspective, he said, I was just fascinated. I can understand how they got themselves where they got themselves. Why would you even want to change this? So then he said, I would just interview people to find out what motivated them. What were their deeper motives? And so he jotted that down, and he said, unfortunately, it stuck because he doesn't like the title of it. It doesn't make sense. People think you're trying to motivate people, or you're a motivational speaker, or so many people, like education, I get this all the time. Well, we don't do a lot of interviews, so maybe we'll just send these people through the training. And that's why I use the terminology, because it's an internationally recognized evidence-based practice. But what I talk about consistently from day one is this is a very strategic method of communication. Somebody opens their mouth, you can assess and you can readjust how you respond to get the optimal outcome. And so, but that's where it came from, as he said, I just interviewed people to find out what motivated them. I was jotting notes down and just wrote, kind of motivational interviewing. And it just stuck when he wrote his first paper. It just stuck.
And it's interesting just even in that explanation and talking through that, the idea of right when you say, well, I was interviewing people, it has just a different feel to it, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Interviewing somebody kind of like this, it's not judgment. We're just having a conversation in that point versus that judgment piece along the way. So that is fascinating.
I think there was a little technology. Go ahead, Casey.
I was just saying, like you were talking about, Erik, you're interviewing, but it's with a sense of genuine curiosity, which makes people lean forward and want to talk more about their thought process if somebody's genuinely listening. And that's just cross-cultural. If we're genuinely non-judgmentally listening to somebody, they will disclose more, they'll talk more.
And it's interesting. I've heard a lot lately of that whole idea of leaning in. And I don't know if it's a buzzword right now, but we've heard a lot of, hey, let's lean into this. But it's that same thing of let's actually be curious about this and lean in and have some conversations. Ryan, you were going to say something?
Oh, just from an ESD 101 standpoint, in your background, because you are dealing with such large groups and going out to groups within the schools, have some of these models been put in place with ESD 101?
I would say very similar models. And Casey, you and I have chatted about this before, when we're talking about how do you change a system. Probably one of the biggest pieces is how do you communicate with people within that system to be able to make changes and authentic changes. And I've had the privilege of going through one of Casey's courses. He's got a bunch of different ones, but the couples course, which was great because I am one of those people that you mentioned it earlier that said, hey, I bring this stuff home and I use this and I talk differently at home because of it. But I think that same stuff works in that larger arena, like you were saying, Ryan, because we are talking about how do we go about making systemic change. And it starts with trust. It starts with communication. And that's exactly some of the things that Casey talks about.
In my normal day job in the legal industry, I find that one thing that has always fascinated me over the last 2 decades is I think younger attorneys in their 20s and 30s getting started out in the practice of law oftentimes think the traditional stereotypical needing to quote unquote win the conversation becomes problematic. And it's because it's so cliche, most folks can reference it, but I have found that there's a lot of satisfaction in conversations in the legal practice where you are working towards a common goal, not necessarily trying to win the conversation per se. Casey, do you find yourself working with law firms or other financial services type organizations?
It less on that side. I work with law enforcement, like Spokane Police Department, and work within the court system as well too. The thing that I like about the clarity of evidence-based practices is you know why you're using it for what specific reason. And this method, motivational interviewing, is specifically if you're trying to affect a behavior change. And tying into what you asked Erik, and Erik was talking about, what I learned in fairly short order when I was doing the training for direct service providers, government, schools, mental health, is the model. You can replicate the basic structure on an individual level, but you can actually use it for a change management model as well too. And because the fundamental dynamics, and this is where I can geek out all day long, is your behavior in alignment with what you say your values are? And so, like when I do an organizational assessment or organizational change, the first thing that I do is I ask for a copy of their vision, mission, and value statement. And I say, can I just talk to a handful of your staff and a handful of your customers? And all I do is I just show them the vision, mission, value statement and say, when you see this, what do you think? And if staff and customers roll their eyes, then I know the organization's behavior is not in line with what they say their values are. And they're going to point to budgets, they're going to point to policy, they're going to point to all sorts of things. Because this model, just like with you're dealing with addiction or mental health or any other issue, diabetes, it's easier for us to blame outside of ourselves than it is to get our behavior in line with what we say our values are. So that works on an individual level. But when I talk to executive leadership and administration, the construct is exactly the same. As soon as our behavior is not in line with what we say our values are, the first thing we do is blame outside of ourselves, or we make an excuse. And it doesn't matter if you're talking to a fourth grader about their homework, or you're talking to an executive director about why they're doing layoffs or cutting pay. The first thing they're going to do is blame outside themselves or make an excuse. So this is where I get so fascinated about the evidence-based, the science side of this. It's used for affecting behavior change. And so when you're thinking about financial institutions, are there times we're trying to affect behavior change? Absolutely. Are there times we're doing education? A lot of the times we're doing education, which is not motivational interviewing. Law enforcement, another great example. Like when I'm training law enforcement, I'll tell them 80 to 90% of the time you're focusing on compliance. That is not a behavior change. That is, you shall do this, or you're going to get in trouble for this. But that 10 to 15% of the time, as a law enforcement officer, you could affect behavior change in the same 10-minute conversation. So do you want compliance, which there's not good data about it having behavior change impact for sustained periods of time, but do you want to affect behavior change? And if you want behavior change, then maybe 10 to 15% of your conversations, you take this tool out of your tool belt. So I think the same thing goes from the financial side or from the legal side with attorneys, the same thing. So much that your job is not necessarily to affect behavior change. It's to come to resolution or negotiation, but it's not necessarily to affect behavior change. So I think that's why you can see overlaps in some of the communication styles, because we want to listen actively, we want to be empathetic. I mean, you're going to hear that in so many communications trainings. Do some reflective statements, but those methods of communication are not necessarily to affect a long-term sustained behavior change.
Thank you, Casey. And what I enjoy about this conversation, why I was interested in both Erik and I having an opportunity to chat with you, is I think the very psychology of the model, the strategies, is very convicting, even to ourselves, to evaluate. Here's how I think I'm communicating. Here's how I'm describing how you should communicate. But am I communicating that way myself?
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And the beauty of this, why I talk about it as a method of communication, where I find this so fascinating, is literally every time you open your mouth, you will get immediate feedback that you can assess from whoever you're talking to, from an individual, a team, an organization. When you open your mouth and there's a response, you can assess where their brain is at in the stages of change just by their response. And then you can respond accordingly. And if you're going to respond accordingly, it's not ways that we would normally respond. It's not ways we've been trained to respond. We tend to react instead of strategically thinking about how can I get the best possible outcome in this conversation? But if we're holding on to an outcome that we want, or we're really invested, then we tend to get more confrontive, or try to educate or convince or coerce or cajole, just all these different things we tend to do to get our way in different situations. And so this method is just, I mean, it's fascinating every time I train it. People just go, my brain does not work this way. Like, this is just, why didn't we learn how to communicate this way? It's so effective, but it's not the way we're trained.
Hmm. Given that this is probably more or as important as ever, given that families are in close proximity during this stay-at-home order, how have you combined the obvious need for these communication skills and the ability to communicate it remotely to people that need it?
Like, we've set up some online trainings, and I do these little called MI minutes, just kind of a snapshot of, in kind of 60 seconds, of ways to think differently. One of the most complex things, I mean, this is what fascinates me when I think of IEPs, when I think of the education system, the legal system. The majority of people that we run into bumps with, and I think of even in times of crisis, is there's an impact with crisis or trauma to executive functioning. That CEO part of our brain, the gray matter of our brain, is impacted in times of crisis or trauma. Like, if there's an explosion outside your door right now, you are not going to function and problem solve the same way as if somebody just asked you to solve a problem. As soon as we're impacted by crisis or trauma, our executive functioning gets impaired, because we want to go back to our primal caveman survival brain. Like, it's just fight or flight. It's just, and so in these times, in family situations, or when we're in isolation periods of time, it's hard to regulate when you're more socially isolated between that fight and flight mode, if you pay attention to what's going on in the world. And then that smarter part of your brain that just goes, I need to not stress so much over these things, but I do need to focus more on these things. It's hard for executive functioning to engage on that level. And we're in fight and flight mode, we tend to be even more egocentric, which means that when you're talking about family or relationship, we tend to focus significantly more on what our needs are, because we're in that fight and flight mode, instead of moving into that, our higher level of executive functioning, of going, this is what's best for the family as a whole, or this is what my child needs, or this is what my spouse needs right now. And I don't need to be afraid in this moment, or have more of that fear reaction, or more of that reactive reaction. Like, I can have more proactive process in this. So
Right.
those are things I try to communicate more.
It's interesting that you talk about that, because in the education world, we talk a lot about trauma and students in trauma, and how we work with those students, and we're thoughtful and making sure that we keep that in mind, because you're right. It's that idea of, if you're send yourself over the line is here. Normally we sit maybe right about here or so, but they're right up against the line all the time. And what we're finding with it, since you mentioned it, Ryan, that we're sitting in this place of the stay-at-home order, we're starting to move up to this level as well. We're starting to experience what trauma is like. And so to have those little 1-minute sections that you put out there, Casey, I know our family listens to them every time they're out there, just because, but it's an important piece to be able to think about the fact that, hey, this is substantial. And when we think about it, even though we show being calm, in our minds are doing something different. They're taking that in, and we are thinking about that flight or fight, and some of those basic pieces. And not only that, but in the education world as well, how do we take that, and how do we start to deal with teachers? Ryan, your wife's a teacher, with all of a sudden your daily life is completely gone, because the kids are out of school right now as well. But then how does that affect the kids as well? And thinking through that also, not just now, but into the future also. So I think that's, I think it's an important piece as you put those out there often about the just the situation that we're in.
If I could throw in there, I think one thing that I've paid close attention to, not only for our clients, but for our own law practice, is the payment protection plan that the federal government and SBA has been rolling out. And I see a nexus between Casey, what you're saying, and Erik, what you're saying, in terms of the psychology of people being pushed to the brink. Our business owners, are they thinking about themselves, or are they thinking about their employees and their team as well? Because clearly everybody's in this together. Everybody is being affected by the stress of this. And I think part of the crux of what both Casey and Erik are saying is that if the management and owners can understand where each side is coming from, and as you said at the beginning, Casey, kind of that walk a mile in their shoes, or be able to get into their position and realize, look, these employees are just as worried as you are as a business owner. Everybody's trying to get through this, and communication is king.
Well, and you take that and you link that exact construct with what we we're just talking about, and people are operating from a crisis or trauma response. So the business owner is thinking, I can't hire anybody if I can't stay in business, if I can't stay afloat. And the employee is saying, how do you expect me to remain loyal if I don't know if I'm going to get paid? I mean, I need to be looking for a different. I mean, it all makes sense on paper. And then how do you navigate in that real time is just incredibly complex. It's the other thing that I was talking about, one of those MI minutes that Erik was talking about, is when you put yourself under this constant pressure, and you are, like Erik was saying, like you get closer and closer to that kind of crisis threshold, that sustained state of mind that you're put in causes anxiety and depression. It's neurochemical. So it's the same thing that you're going to see when you're talking about, I don't care how great of a business person they are, but if they're in this situation right now, the longer you're exposed to that, the more you're going to start to experience symptoms of depression and anxiety, because you're in this fight and flight mode. At the same time, your executive functioning is trying to stay on top of all this. But you can feel it percolating more and more and pushing you to a place where it feels more and more, there's more and more discomfort, which makes you, when you get home, more snappy with your family, more reactive, and then you start to beat up on yourself for it, which causes more internal trauma and stress. And this is where you can start to see some of the short-term and long-term effects of where we're at with COVID right now. Well,
that's been one of my concerns, Casey, is dealing with the healthcare pandemic alongside the economic kind of disastrous news we're seeing, 6 and 7 million unemployment. That obviously has been one of my concerns for our country and for the world, but for our country and here in Spokane is this collision of continuing to be glass half full, continuing to do the right thing for the healthcare response, but butting up against this issue, as you're describing, the real stresses and depression that you're seeing probably in the business community of how long is this going to last? Can I keep my restaurant afloat? Can I keep my small business afloat? And where are these going to cross on the graph in terms of keeping everybody healthy, emotionally, mentally, and physically?
Exactly. Well, the thing that stood out to me, I'm getting ready to do this week, I'll be doing a training for King County. They're this amazing program they just hired up for. They're having caseworkers in full PPE go out, but they're working with people that are in the homeless tent cities in Seattle to see if they'll shelter in place if they give them a hotel room, because they know that if it hits the tent cities, the healthcare system is going to buckle. So I'm going to be training a lot of these outreach workers. And I think the thing that I think of when we're talking from the business perspective is having those conversations this morning with King County. It does give you a perspective on power and privilege as well, too, that I look at myself in, because the way that I've always run my business with my team is, as long as we're of service, we'll be in business. And so I'm not going to guarantee that we'll have jobs a year from now, because if we're not of value to people, then we shouldn't. I'm not going to fight for contracts if we're not value added. We're all meant to be doing different things. But to be able to even have that mentality is operating from a place of power and privilege. So because I have a spouse that has solid income and I have money in savings, and so it is easier even as a business owner, knowing all these methods and the efficacy of them, to be able to practice what I preach from a business perspective and not get
Right.
too stressed, even though we're right on the edge of, can we keep our doors open? But my team, from being a flat hierarchy, we all row together, knowing if it goes down, we're all meant to be in a different place doing different things, making a difference in the world, and maybe the business isn't meant to be in place. But to be able to even be in that perspective is such a place of power and privilege. I mean, just
Right.
most people in a crisis response, or they don't have that. It's easier to have that kind of spiritual or perspective or whatever, when you don't have a bill collector yanking you out of your door by your foot, and these fears of what's going to happen. So I love the
Mhm.
model. I think it's so effective, but I've learned so much in these last 2 weeks too. You just get pushed to think on so many different levels about how do these things, these structures or infrastructures, maintain themselves, whether it's in public nonprofit, whether it's in the business world. It just is fascinating.
Well,
You know,
I love your example that you're bringing up regarding, I would use the word hope, that depending on where you sit in terms of privilege, and as you indicated, that if we can instill as much hope that there are going to be silver linings from this, and probably to your point, I'm actually uh, I've certainly been as stressed as anybody monitoring the healthcare news, financial news, et cetera, and figuring out how best to bring our teams through this. However, I refuse to believe there's not going to be a multitude of silver linings, at least specifically to the point of making people aware to think outside the box of what we were thinking before. Uh,
Yeah.
Clearly, that's not. This has been such a tragedy with the death and loss we've seen, that I do believe in the business community. I think there will be silver linings to stretching our intellect.
Yes. Well,
mhm.
and through all of it, and again, this is why this has become more of a way of life for me than even just my job. I mean, it's really is how I try to live my life, because of some of the core constructs in this model. And what it does come down to is the only thing, and this is it's you can go so many directions with it, but I've explored this so much. The only thing I do have control over is my own behavior. I mean, we can see that in quotes, we can see it in
Yeah.
pithy one line, in signature lines. But this is a push come to shove at this state, this in the middle of this kind of crisis, and this pandemic is truly the only thing I have control over is my own behavior and how I respond to that. And there's something frightening and relieving in that, in the same breath. And what I appreciate about why I'm so obsessed with this particular model is it really keeps you on, are my behaviors in alignment with what I say my values are? Because that is the only thing I have control over. Is my behavior in line with my values when I'm talking to my spouse? Is my behavior in alignment with my
Mhm.
values when I'm talking to my children? And
Mhm.
when it's not, I want to blame outside of myself and I want to make excuses. So it's such a beautiful airtight model in so
Right.
many levels. So as a business owner, as an executive director, is my behavior in line with what I say my values are? Well, I really want to blame outside of myself and make excuses. It just goes across every dimension, and that's why I left a career in social service and direct service to try to be able to provide this structure for people, because it really becomes a game changer personally and professionally
Mhm.
when you realize that this really is a stabilizing force in your thought process.
I
Well, and
love.
that's a piece.
Go ahead, Eric.
No, that's a piece that was definitely on my list to ask you about today, was the whole idea of values, and actually sitting and listening to you both talk on that business side of it, and the hope and some of those pieces. And then Casey, you came back to these values and do my actions match with the values. But that's a big piece, and I want to move it also beyond the business side to more of relationships as well, and at home, since we're all sitting at home, right? And we've got kids and so on sitting at home as well. I know that was a piece that definitely stuck out to me when Jessica and I went through that course for couples, and it was that was a piece, that the whole idea of, do we truly know our values, and are we living towards our values, and making sure that our actions are going towards our values. And as I think about where we are right now and where we're stuck at home, are we truly living to that? Because I think that's that piece that really, even when we get those little snippiness to one another, those are the pieces that we need to come back to. So I'm glad to hear the talk of values and how important those are.
Well, and I think that a great part of this entire conversation, as I said before, is these principles essentially put a mirror up in front of yourself to think through, okay, how can I change or model these values that you speak of, which, like you said, it's not the first thing most people go to. It's figuring out how to blame somebody else, which clearly does not lead to a good resolution.
That's exactly it. It,
I,
one of the things I do in my personal relationships as a parent, when I'm using it as a therapist too, as a clinician, with clients that I still see, one of the things that helps me, because I'm such a visual person, on how to be in alignment with that, is I just think, if I was sitting in a theater watching this on a movie screen, how would I have respect? Like, what would cause me to sit there after the lights come up and sit there staring at the screen going, oh my God, how do they navigate? How are they able to operate with such a high level of integrity? And so in my interpersonal relationships, like when I want to be frustrated with my spouse, or, frustrated with my kids, I just think, how would you act in a way that really lines up with somebody you would really respect, that has integrity? And so I have to tamp down every human Casey Jackson response that I want to have. And I think this lines up with who I really want to be, instead of justifying that I'm short-tempered, or I'm tired, or I'm stressed, because that's blaming outside myself for making an excuse. When I have the internal fortitude, I have the capacity to make a healthier decision. So I'm not going to justify making a bad decision, because that takes a lot of energy to justify that and rationalize that in my own brain. I'm going to take that exact same amount of brain energy that it takes to do the right thing for the right reasons. And that makes a profound difference in the way things play out, and how you work towards getting your behavior in alignment with what your values are. It really is that fake it till you make it. I may be exhausted, I may be frustrated. It's like, operate in alignment with your values, and you're not going to regret that. And it's going to take less residual energy to try to clean that up afterwards anyway, if you just do the right thing the first time.
well, I think, again, the premise of where you're going with the principles and fundamental models is providing hope for relationships, hope for organizations to work towards better outcomes. Erik and Jessica obviously have done the course and recommended it to Sarah and I, and we're excited to do it. I think we were scheduled potentially early March, and then, of course, what we're all aware of. So maybe we should still consider doing an online version. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm totally up for that.
Well, I
It's
know
well worth
Sarah.
it. It'd be great.
It would be a lot of fun. I'm up for it. I think maybe we look at doing that.
Sounds good. We definitely can do that. It's not a problem at all.
Well, both Casey and Erik, thank you. Appreciate under these remote circumstances talking about such an important issue of communication. As we've all been mentioning, probably more so than ever, it's certainly something we all can improve on.
Well, thanks for inviting. This was great. It's fun for me to get my own thoughts out of my head too. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat about it.
Let's try
Thank
to
you,
do it.
Casey.
Yeah, thank you so much, and let's try to do this maybe again here in the next couple of weeks.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Have a good day, both of you.
Take care.